Welcome to episode 96 of the Forward for 50 podcast, where we interview people over 50 who are pursuing new direction for their lives. It's an opportunity for men and women to tell their stories their way and in their own words. I'm Greg Gerber, the founder of Forward from 50, and your host for today's show. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Jordan Grumet, who is a hospice doctor and purpose pioneer. The conversation had a profound effect on my own understanding of the need for meaning rather than purpose after turning 50. In this conversation, Jordan shares his insights on living a rich life with passion. He reminds us that true fulfillment is not measured by financial success, but rather by the energy, courage, and time we invest in whatever truly lights us up. He notes meaning for our lives is more about the narrative we create and tell ourselves. Those stories work to form the foundation of our identity. Purpose, however, is more about action. It's the drive to pursue whatever brings us joy and ignites our passion, not only in the present, but also in the future. Jordan distinguishes between what he calls big P purpose and little p purpose. Big P purpose represents the grand, audacious goals we often set for ourselves, yet those ambitions can sometimes be so towering they can lead to frustration or anxiety when we don't meet them. On the other hand, little p purpose is about the daily, process-oriented actions that truly invigorate us. These are the small, meaningful pursuits which enrich our lives, foster deep connections, and gradually build our legacy. To tell us how little p purpose gives our lives the meaning we desperately need, please welcome hospice doctor Jordan Grumet to the show. Thanks for joining me today, Jordan. I really appreciate the time. You have been involved in working with a group of people who have come to the end of their life and are expressing their regrets to you and things like that. And I think that'd be an important topic for all seasoned citizens to consider. What have you learned over the years?
Interestingly enough, I find that people never say, I wish I made more money. They never say, I wish I worked more nights or weekends. Really, they say some version of, I really wish I had the energy, courage, or time to do, and then fill in the blank. And that blank is different for different people, right? Because some people dreamed of becoming an author. Other people wanted to get on, be a race car driver. Other people had something else that was big or important to them. So it's different from each person, but the theme is that there was this thing that was deeply important to them, maybe even helped define who they were, that they never had the courage or time or energy to pursue.
That's right. And why don't they pursue that? What is it that seems to be holding people back?
I think there are two things. One is to think about the deeply important things in your life and to set out to do them is to recognize that time is finite and realize you might get to the end and not reach those things. And that's incredibly difficult. So one way of dealing with it is just don't think about them. So that's point one. I think the other point is it's about courage. People are afraid they're going to fail. And this is the problem is like when you're afraid you're going to fail, it's just easier to put it off. And so I think a lot of people put it off. And then a doctor like me, a hospice doctor, walks in and they realize that they may have put it off too long.
That's certainly true. I work with another client called the Work Camper program. It's people who live full-time in their RVs and travel around the country working short-term jobs. It's an opportunity to get paid while they travel. And one of the biggest things that we hear all the time is people saying, I wish I had started this earlier, because they think they have to wait until they're 65, retire, and then start doing this. But by that time, they might already have a debilitating illness or injury or something like that that prevents them from truly enjoying it. So doing it now seems to be the mantra that we need to be following.
So there's this idea of memento mori, this idea that we carry the idea that we could die at any time with us during life. And what it really is a call to realize is that life is finite and short, and we don't know how much time we have. And so if something is deeply important to you, you really want to start it now.
You became a hospice doctor. What led you into that field?
Interestingly enough, my father died when I was 7. He died suddenly. He actually was a physician. He died while he was rounding in the hospital, had a brain aneurysm and collapsed. But I didn't really have much support around him dying, right? I had my mom and my family, but not a lot of support from the healthcare community. So I eventually decided I wanted to be a doctor, and I went to Northwestern University. And in my first week of medical school, I volunteered in the inpatient hospice. And I guess one of the reasons is I was comfortable with this idea of death. I had lived through the death of a parent, and I felt like I had a lot to offer. This wasn't something that scared me. It was something I felt more comfortable with, and certainly it was something I didn't have when I was little. Now, I actually really loved volunteering in hospice, but once I got my education and started residency, I told myself hospice isn't something you do for a career. It's something on the side, something that doesn't pay much or isn't as glorious, let's say, as being the general internal doctor who's making the tough diagnoses. So I dropped this idea of doing hospice work for years and years and only came back to it later as a general internal medicine doctor when I was treating elderly patients. And one of the hospice teams came by and said, "You're doing such a good job of this. Would you like to work with us?" And it was a really lucky turn of events because it became the piece of medicine that I loved, whereas I pretty much burned out on everything else. And so it was a lucky coincidence that I ended up there, but maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was the thing that I was good at. And that's why I ended up taking care of lots of elderly patients.
Sounds like you were created for that purpose. But one of the things that I found interesting in the book that I've been reading, which is Taking Stock, The Regrets of the Dying, is that you started subtracting things out of your life that weren't providing you that joy.
So ultimately, what we're looking at is how do I create a life full of purpose? And so a lot of times we think about adding in purposeful activities. But when I decided I was burned out in medicine, I didn't know what those purposeful activities were. So I could have just left medicine. But I had nothing to fill that void with. So instead, I artfully started using the art of subtraction. It meant that I started looking at my job and saying, what doesn't fill me up? What isn't exciting? And can I piecemeal start getting rid of these things? And so the first thing I did is I got rid of my practice, which was exhausting. And I started working only in nursing homes and hospice and doing some other things. And then I got rid of nights and weekends. And over a bunch of years, I got rid of more and more of those things that I didn't like. And what I was left with was hospice.
Do people have to wait until they get to a certain age before they can start subtracting these things? Or should they be doing this throughout their lives?
I think we should be doing it as soon as possible because ultimately winning the game is filling your time up with as many things you love and as few things you loathe. Now, it is true. A lot of us, especially at the beginning of our careers, we don't have a lot of money. And so we have to make a living, but we should still be looking at our job and saying, what do I love and what don't I love? And maybe can I start changing things around at work that make it better? So for instance, I started realizing I love the hospice work and I didn't love everything else. I was lucky because my finances were in order, so I could afford to start getting rid of things. But if this was at the beginning of my career when I didn't have much money, I could have recognized this and I could have done much more hospice work and really stopped doing the other things. I could have become a full-time hospice medical director. And yes, I would have been paid a little bit less, but I would have enjoyed my life a lot more and I would have had much better career longevity. And so my finances might have taken a little bit longer to get in order, but it would have been worthwhile to do something on a daily basis that I really loved. So I really think we should start thinking about the art of subtraction now because it might help identify the things we do love so we can start building more of those things into our life and getting rid of more of the things we don't like.
I see that as being a common theme among many of the people over 50 that I've been interviewing. They feel early in their life, in their teens and their 20s, that they should go in this specific direction. They get really fired up when they talk about it and when they engage in those kind of activities. But well-meaning friends and family tell them, no, you can't make money doing that. You have to do something more practical. So they bury the desire of their heart and they do things like becoming a doctor or whatever the case might be, which brings them good income, but no joy. There's got to be some sort of connection that, or balance that we should pursue in something like that. What would you think about that?
I think our goal long-term should be to have more and more of that connection and joy. And again, I'm not Pollyanna about it. I don't think everything we have to do has to be passionate. In fact, I think a lot of people are in jobs that aren't passionate. But as we move further and get more financially stable, we should be building that passion into more and more things that we do. A great example of, I have a friend who works in corporate America and she doesn't love her job, but she's very interested in women's place in corporate America. So she started writing a blog about it, just something joyful she added into her life. Wasn't making any money, just liked doing it. She liked writing that blog so much, she started setting up programs for her business in her free time because she wanted other people to learn about this, to talk about women's place in corporate America. she started doing such a good job with these programs. Her boss eventually said, you know what, let's put you down to 50% at your current job and let's use the other 50% for you to create more of these programs. So it's a perfect example of how you can go after the things you enjoy. Maybe it affects your career, maybe it doesn't. But over time, it can start becoming part of your career. And I think that's where that mix of passion versus necessity plays in.
Would a side hustle help people in getting this joy in their life?
I think if you have time and energy, a side hustle is a great way to take something purposeful and start building it in, let's say on a weekend, spend 3 or 4 hours a week doing it. And if you make some extra money, that might give you some margin to stop doing things during the week you don't like. But even if you don't make any money, you've still added in something joyful and purposeful to your life. And so I think you're better off either way.
I remember Forward from 50 is designed to help people live more purposeful lives. But after listening to your book, I realized that maybe I am being too broad and too general in saying that people need purpose, when in fact they need meaning. Is there a difference between purpose and meaning?
Purpose and meaning, I say, are the ingredients to happiness, but you need both, and they're slightly different things. Meaning is about our cognitive thoughts of the past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's generally a journey to enough. And so happy people tend to tell themselves a heroic story about their past. They see their traumas and their problems. They realize that they rose above them. And so they feel like they're enough in the present, and they figure they'll continue to be enough in the future too. Unhappy people tell themselves more of a victim story. They feel like they were thwarted in the past. They feel thwarted in the present and figure they'll be thwarted in the future too. They never feel like they were enough. So meaning is a journey to enough. Purpose is a little different. Purpose is about the present and future, and it's all about actions. It's simply doing the things that light us up. The reason why I see you need both, and often I tell people you have to start working on meaning first, is if you don't have a good sense of meaning and don't feel enough, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking they can purpose their way to enough, purpose their way to happiness. And so purpose becomes something they use to prove their worthiness with. And it just doesn't work when they try to prove themselves through purpose. We see this in the ultra high achievers who still look unhappy. Steve Jobs was a perfect example, right? Mm-hmm. This guy created some of the greatest tech ever, made tons of money, but he never really looked happy. And I think part of that was he had a meaning problem. He had to go back and really deal with his issues of being adopted and how he felt about himself and about his own sense of enough. No matter how much he achieved with purpose, it didn't fill that hole, that void. So I agree. I think people have to start with meaning. And once they feel good about being enough as a person, then they can joyfully jump into the present and future action. That's purpose.
It's unfortunate how childhood trauma like that can really derail a person and follow them throughout their entire life.
I think it's very true. And I think a lot of the work we do as adults is getting over some of that either generational trauma handed to us from our parents and previous generations, or lived trauma, which is trauma we lived through as kids. And a lot of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves start when we're really young. And going unchecked, those stories can last for decades and decades, and a lot of them just aren't helpful in adulthood. So they might be helpful as a kid because the story you tell yourself might drive you to be ambitious and achieve a lot. But as you become an adult and are successful, that drive and ambition sometimes actually makes you more frustrated and unhappy, but you've been telling yourself that story for so long. Sometimes it's really hard to undo it.
I understand how important it is to tell yourself a better story, but many people are unsure of how to go about doing that. It just seems too simple. Is it really just changing your internal dialogue is enough to propel you in a different direction?
I think you need to change your internal dialogue, but it's not easy. So I wouldn't call it simple. And the reason why is something called neuroplasticity. If you've been telling yourself the same story over decades and decades, it almost imprints on your neurons. It changes the way you think. And so when you come to realize that those stories weren't serving you and start building new stories, they don't just immediately implant. It takes weeks, months, and years of things like affirmations and visualization and meditation to rewrite those neurons so that you start believing it. Because otherwise we get those demons, right? You start doing something you deeply enjoy and the demons come up and say, yeah, but how are you changing the world? Why aren't you making money? How is this moving things forward? Are people going to really remember you because you did this thing? And those demons try to convince you to go back to those old narratives of not being enough. And so what you need to do is fight them with things like affirmations, repetition, visualization. It is the work of a lifetime. This is not easy. A lot of people actually go to their therapist for this. They do something called narrative therapy. It takes time.
I would imagine that it's not something that's going to take place overnight, but there are minor tweaks that we can do right now that can start that going forward. And I look at like somebody trying to quit smoking. If they identify themselves as a smoker trying to quit, it's different than being a non-smoker, right? That's simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, some of it is just the simple mindset change. So what I always think about this is I feel like it's a valve that's closed and the pressure is growing and growing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing we need to do is open that valve to a little bit of the pressure out. And a lot of times that is telling yourself the new narrative. But once you start that, then some of the harder, more enduring work begins, but it's easier because you've let a little bit of that pressure out to start with. And I think that's where a lot of people are, is you have to first recognize those bad narratives, start rewriting new narratives, but then, yeah, it's time to dig in. It's not easy work.
When it comes to purpose and passion, I think it would be possible to turn a hobby into a purpose. For example, a friend of mine loved to invest, and he started making money, and he just got into this thing, what a lot of us do, where more and more is what was needed. And so he would focus on generating more money through his investments. But one day he realized that I have more than enough. I need to start giving that away. So he made a little tweak, and he set up charities every month, and he decided that I'm going to work on my investments and try and make as much as I can that month, which was his passion, but then give it away to help some charity.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful with goals. And so what I always tell people is do things that light you up, that you enjoy the process of. Don't do things that you don't like, but you're really searching for that goal. So if he loves investing and buying and selling and studying, and that lights him up, regardless of what things look like at the end of the month, then that is a well-spent activity. On the other hand, let's say he really wants to give money away and loves seeing his net worth increase, but hates the stress of looking at everything every day, and he starts being anxious at night because the numbers are down and those kind of things. If the process isn't lighting you up, then I think you're missing the boat. We should be a little bit more goal agnostic. Like we can set these goals, and if we hit it, great. But if we don't hit the goal, as long as we enjoy the process, we're doing well.
Mm-hmm. Does purpose impact our identity in any way?
I always think of purpose is almost a product of our identity, right? So our identity is who we are. Our intention is how we go about trying to bring that identity to life, and purpose are the actions that we consume ourselves with living up to that identity and intention. So purpose is very action-oriented, whereas identity, again, is much more about thoughts and probably goes back to meaning too. A lot of our identity is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and what feels important to us. And so we can't control the outcomes, but we can take that identity and have really good intentions about how we're going to live that in the world. But then purpose is the actual actions we take to live that out. And so that's how I like to look at it. Again, I like to divorce purpose from thought, and I really like to think of it more in the realm of actions.
Do connections play a role in any of this? And identifying our purpose and our meaning and things like that? Connecting with people, is it involving that?
So here's the thing. If you look at some of the best studies about happiness, and I look at the Harvard Adult Developmental Health Study, started in the 30s, took about 700 Harvard students, followed them every 2 years, putting them through questionnaires, eventually brought in some family members and then some controls, ended up being thousands and thousands of people. And they not only did questionnaires every 2 years, they started doing MRIs and blood tests and EEGs and all sorts of great stuff. And after 80 years of doing this research, they found that the thing most connected to happiness wasn't wealth, wasn't achievements, wasn't your job, wasn't even purpose. And we'll talk about this in a minute. What they actually found made people most happy were interpersonal relationships and connections. Yeah. So connections and community mean everything. Now, I tell people all the time, look, if you look at purpose and look at the studies, purpose is actually associated with happiness, longevity, and health. And they say, yeah, but the Harvard Developmental Health Study didn't show that. What I often tell people is purpose is a great conduit to communities and connections and interpersonal relationships. Why? Because when you pursue process-oriented purpose, what I call a little p purpose, things that light you up, like a moth to a flame, you attract other people and they want to collaborate with you. If they have something to teach you, they want to teach you. If they have something to learn from you, they want to be students. This is how you build communities, is you do things that deeply light you up, and the happy side effect are these relationships. And I think that's where happiness really lies.
Okay, so there is a difference between purpose, the big overall goal, and the little p purpose, the things you do every day.
Yeah, and the little p purpose is process oriented. Big p purpose, what I think is toxic and not good, is goal oriented purpose. Because a lot of times we find ourselves doing things that don't light us up to reach that purpose. And often it's so big, it's easy to fail, like becoming president or a billionaire, these huge things that we shoot for. A lot of times it just leaves us with anxiety and frustration.
Are there any things that we can do to anchor to our purpose?
So I always tell people you don't find your purpose, you build it or create it. But it is true, you need exactly what you just talked about, anchors of purpose. These are inklings or beckonings to build a life of purpose around, but you're going to have to build that life. So it's a very active process. But the first step is to identify those anchors. What lights you up? And if you can start thinking about what lights you up, you can then build purpose around those things.
Okay. So there is no purpose that we're born to pursue, etc. It's something that really triggers us or ignites us, and then we build our life around that.
Yeah, look, purpose can be almost anything, in my opinion, as long as it's process oriented, right? Your purpose can last a day, or it could last a week, or it could last a lifetime. It could immediately change the world, but it certainly doesn't have to. You could have one purpose, or most people have multiple. And I think that's all fine. And you can be promiscuous with your purpose. You can change from thing to thing. As soon as it stops lighting you up, it's time to move on.
I believe you had talked recently about 4 anchor purposes, and one of them was, if you die tomorrow, what will I regret about dying?
Or more importantly, what will I regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? So what we're talking about is ways otherwise healthy person or someone at least not on their deathbed could start thinking about purpose anchors and identifying them. A great way is to ask yourself that regret question. It comes from the Hospice Life Review. When we sit with dying patients, we often ask them these structured series of questions to help them reconcile their past. But that regret question is a great way to start thinking about what could be a purpose anchor in my life today. And for me, for instance, 10 years ago, if you had asked me what would I really regret not doing, I would have immediately answered not traditionally publishing a book. So that was a purpose anchor for me. I had to take what could be a regret and turn it into an anchor and then build a life of purpose around that, which was writing my first book, Taking Stock, and eventually this current book, The Purpose Code.
Do our childhood desires have any insight to what might give us purpose?
I think there are also great purpose anchors to be found in our childhood desires, our joys. Remember, kids often live very purposeful lives. If you set them off to do something on a free day, they'll go and they'll play, they'll get involved in a sport, they'll play cops and robbers, they'll build a fort. All of these things are done without a huge goal in mind. They just want to have fun. In fact, a lot of times they lose track of time and miss dinner if you don't go and call them and bring them in. Kids are very purposeful, but at some point we start getting tracked into a career in school and we start thinking of those things as childish and moving on to the more important work of being an adult. But if you're looking for purpose anchors, think about what trophies were in your room as a kid, what drawings, what posters. Those could be great purpose anchors. Hey, for me, a great one was baseball cards. I used to love collecting baseball cards as a kid. I stopped as I got busier, went to high school, and started thinking about becoming a doctor. But every time I'm on Facebook and I see something about old-time baseball players or something about baseball cards, it lights me up. I happen to be really busy, but if I was ever searching for purpose anchors, there's one right there from my childhood that could bring me a lot of joy.
A lot of people over 60 still don't know what they'd like to do or what gives them joy. So we've been recommending that people just go out and volunteer. Try a bunch of different things. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, that's called the spaghetti method. And it's also a way to find purpose anchors if nothing else resonates with. Try a bunch of new things, hang out with new people, maybe do something that makes you feel slightly uncomfortable for a day and see if any of that lights you up. And it does. That might be a great place to start building purpose.
Can you talk a little bit about artist attraction? You had mentioned that in one of the books and how it helps you find your purpose.
Yeah, the art of subtraction. So a lot of people are stuck in jobs that they don't like. And if we're looking for purpose anchors, one thing to do is write out all your roles and responsibilities for your job. Let's say there are 15 or 20 of them. And then go through and scratch out everything you don't like. And then try to see if there's anything left over that you do. And if you do, try building more of a work life around that thing. So for me, a perfect example is hospice. When I got rid of everything I didn't like at work, hospice work was left over. It was the one thing I would do even if you weren't paying me for it. And so I knew that was a great purpose anchor through subtraction. I'm like, okay, this is something I like. I could start building some purpose around that. And that's exactly what I did.
It sounded earlier like you said the more connected you are, the happier you're going to be. That might be bad news for introverts who don't like to get out and associate with people. What do you think about that?
Here's the thing. What I found is even introverts, when they do things that light them up, end up connecting to other people. Now, it may be online, right? It might be on a forum. It might not necessarily be in person, but think about any introvert you know. Most likely they have something that lights them up, and probably they have a few friends or people they interact with about that thing, even if they don't love being in big crowds. So just because you're an introvert doesn't mean that you don't need interpersonal interactions or love or connection. Introverts get married, they have friends, they do all the things that extroverts do. You just need it in a different manner. But I don't think that being an introvert stops you from making these important connections. And maybe you have fewer of them, right? Maybe you have 2 or 3 really close connections where an extrovert may have 100 of them, but they can be just as fulfilling.
As long as they're connected and they're being involved with people. So it
Very
still
much.
takes effort to get out there and do that. And is online connections, are they the same as interpersonal connections?
So I think online connections are close. I do still feel like sometimes being in the same room with a person adds something different and nuanced to see their face, to feel their interactions, all those things we don't necessarily get on the internet. But I wouldn't say that it has to be that way. So there are a lot of people like me. When I got into the personal finance world and started building a community around that, a lot of my friends just live all over the country. So for better or for worse, we interact on Zoom because it's easier. I'd love to be around them all the time, and I certainly try to take as many chances as I can get to be in the same room with them. But I don't think all is lost. I think we're adaptable people, and you find what's most comfortable for you.
You had mentioned a story about how one person's decision years ago actually turned the life around or saved the lives of other individuals decades later. Can you share that with my audience?
Certainly. So when I talk about purpose, I talk about the difference between big P purpose, big, audacious, goal-oriented purpose that in America, at least, we think if you can think it, you build it. So it's always big, like being a billionaire, becoming president. And people always think that's how you have a lot of impact in the world. But I argue that little p purpose is more important. Little p is process oriented and it's doing things that light you up. And the biggest criticism I always get is, isn't that selfish? That's a privilege. I want to do things that change the world. Why would I do something so self-centered? And so I always tell them the story of my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather died 10 years before I was born in the 1960s. And he changed the world, but he did it by pursuing something that deeply lit him up. He loved math. And because he loved math, he became a CPA, not to change the world, but because that's what he liked doing. Mm-hmm. And back in the 1950s, when my mom was a little girl, she would sit on his lap and he would show her his spreadsheets, because remember, there weren't computers then. It was all on paper. And he'd take a pencil out and he'd show her all the numbers he was putting in the boxes and why. And she saw her father lit up, so she tried on that identity and decided that she loved math too. Fast forward to after he died and I was born, I had a learning disability. I had trouble learning how to read, and everyone in my class was doing their basic readers and was moving forward, and I was stuck coloring in a coloring book with a crayon. Now, I think I would have thought everything was lost, but for one issue. I loved math too, and because of that, I took to it, and I was one of the top people in the class at math. So because of this love of math that had been modeled for me by my mother and my maternal grandfather, who I never met, it helped me get past my learning disability. I eventually became a doctor, a highly mathematical field. And during my first years of practice, I met a patient who kept on getting admitted to the hospital for dehydration. He would come in at death's doorstep. And we would hydrate him, send him out, and he kept coming back. Eventually, I noticed a mathematical connection between 2 of his lab results because I loved math. And we made a rare diagnosis that actually got treated with a simple medication. He stopped getting dehydrated. He stopped coming into the hospital. And he was a pastor at a local church, and he took in homeless kids and often provided them social services, or if they're old enough, work and food. And so you can track one man pursuing his little p purpose back in the 1950s and 60s, changing the world 60 years later and hundreds of miles away from where he resided. Because he loved math, some kid hundreds of miles away 60 years later is getting what they need and maybe having their lives saved from living on the street. And this is all because one guy did something that lit him up. And like a pebble dropped into the ocean, he displaced a little water, and that displacement added to other ones, forming larger waves at time and smaller waves at other times. It would dissipate, but eventually it would come up on multiple shores, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. His impact is still being felt, even though no one knows his name. He's not in any record books. but his sense of purpose carries on. And that's what I want for everyone listening to this, is I want them to do things that light them up so that your version of purpose can lead to an impact and legacy. Again, maybe not one that anyone's going to write about in any history books, but one that matters.
That's a great point, because I think a lot of us over the age of 50, and certainly as we get older, want to leave a legacy for our community and for our families, etc. And many times we think that's got to be a big financial gift or something to that effect, or we have to be known for doing something great and spectacular. But it's as simple as really showing others what gives you passion. So if you love gardening, for example, you can show or leave a legacy by helping other people fall in love with growing flowers.
Yeah, and that can change the world, because someone can find their peace there because of that generational growth you modeled for them. And maybe their gardens create beauty that helps communities. Maybe they take in someone who's a troubled youth and teach them gardening, and that changes their life. Maybe they make a business out of it, and because they make such beautiful flowers, people pay them for their flowers, and those flowers make hundreds and hundreds of other people's lives better.
Exactly.
All of this is possible. Maybe you start a business making flowers and you hire someone who's in need, and now they have a job and you can provide for them. It just goes on and on. But the key here is the purpose, the little p purpose. Do things that light you up, and it will attract other people to you. It will cause connections. It will change the world. It'll not only make you happy, but your touch will stay in the world even after you're gone. And I think that's the best we can hope for. We're not going to live forever, but the impact of our lives can.
Do you have any regrets yourself? If you could roll back the clock, is there anything you'd do differently?
I'll tell you, I think my last really major regret was that I hadn't traditionally published a book, which I eventually did in 2022. And no, I'm pretty at peace with this idea that most of the things that were truly deeply important to me, I either tried, got involved with, or accomplished. That may change over time, though, right? And I'm open to this idea that I might develop new regrets, and then I can joyfully turn them into purpose anchors. God forbid, if something was to happen to me, I feel relatively at peace that I've done what I was meant to do.
You also learned how to podcast rather late in life. Tell us about that.
I did. Oh, I love podcasting. One of my favorite things to do, a great example of little p purpose for me. And the reason why is if you put me in front of a mic and give me someone to interview, you better believe I'm going to enjoy that hour that it takes to do it. And doesn't even matter what comes of it. Of course, I'd love to get lots of downloads. Of course, I'd love to have tons of people hear it. But even if they don't, it was still really a great hour. And so podcasting really fulfills that for me. It's a wonderful version of little p purpose, because the process of doing it causes joy. Now, don't get me wrong. I have some goals. I'd love my podcast to get out to more people, but the joy of doing it isn't incumbent on whether I meet that goal or not. I enjoy it regardless. And that's why it's a really good version of purpose for me.
What is your podcast, and how can people find it?
The podcast is called Earn and Invest. The best way to find it, actually, or to find either of my two books, Taking Stock or The Purpose Code, is to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. And you'll see links to my books, as well as the places I create content, including the Earn and Invest podcast and the Purpose Code Substack.
Do you have any advice for people over the age of 50 who are trying to find their purpose?
So first of all, it's never too late to start thinking about purpose. I start thinking about purpose with people on their deathbeds when they have weeks and months. If they can think about purpose, you certainly can way before that. The other thing I tell people is you don't find purpose, you create it. So start thinking about these anchors of purpose in your life, but then it's up to you to build a life of purpose around them. And last but not least, purpose is abundant. Think about all the things that could light you up and start pursuing them.
What are some of the things that people have regretted on their deathbed? You had mentioned one that they had not really had the courage and the energy to pursue, or time to pursue things. Are there others that seem to be common among people?
I think that's the main one, because remember, that's a theme, and then you have to fill in the blank. Sorry, I never had the energy, courage, or time to, but then the to is what's individual to each person. But there also tend to be regrets about people, like the important people in your life and whether you connected or reconnected with them. That tends to be a big one. I'll tell you what it almost never is. It's almost never, I wish I bought that thing. It's never, I wish I had a net worth of $1.5 million as opposed to just $1 million. Those things don't tend to come up. Usually when people talk about regretting things having to do with money, it isn't the money itself. It's that they could have used the money to fulfill other versions of purpose for them or take care of other people they wanted to take care of.
I interviewed somebody recently who is on a stage 4 diagnosis and not expected to make it past April. And one of the things that he had to do was restore a relationship that had been broken for more than 30 years. So is there something that we should be doing now to restore those relationships or to enhance the ones that we have?
So obviously, I don't know your exact situation. I don't know what you've gone through. But if you think you're going to regret not pursuing that relationship or fixing it, then it's time to start doing it now as opposed to putting it off. There's going to be no better time than the present.
Regret is a horrible thing to live with, I would imagine. You had mentioned your website again. Can you give that to me one more time as a way for people to connect with you?
JordanGrumet.com. That's JordanGrumet.com.
Are you also active on social media that people could follow you?
You can find me at Earn and Invest. That's AN Invest on Instagram and X. And believe it or not, on Facebook, I'm under Doc Green because I started as Doc G and they made me change it.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing your story today and all this practical advice with us. I think it's something that all people over 50 really need to consider now. And the earlier they do it, the happier they'll be in their retirement. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed speaking with Dr. Jordan Grumet today. I found his insight between purpose and meaning to be tremendously valuable for seasoned citizens who wonder whether there is more to life than what they're currently living. Our conversation reminds us that when we look back on our lives, it's not the dollars earned or the titles we held that we regret. It's usually the missed opportunities we had to pursue those things that truly excite us. Too often we find ourselves postponing our passions out of fear, practicality, or simply because we let life's demands crowd out our dreams. Jordan introduced us to the concept of the art of subtraction, or the practice of intentionally removing aspects of our work and life that drain us, both emotionally and physically. Doing so reveals and amplifies those activities which bring us genuine joy and fulfillment. A meaningful life isn't about abandoning responsibilities, but rather it is shaping our days so that we have room for those little pursuits which, cumulatively, define a life of purpose. The narrative we create about our journey toward feeling whether we have enough or have done enough reframes our challenges and triumphs into stories of resilience. Purpose, by contrast, is more about the daily process-oriented pursuits which propel us into the future with passion and vitality. Jordan's explanation of Big P purpose may involve grand, often overwhelming goals that can lead to anxiety or disappointment when they aren't met. Little P purpose, on the other hand, is found in the everyday moments which ignite our inner fire and lead us to build genuine connections with those around us. Studies show that deep interpersonal relationships are at the heart of lasting happiness. Whether those connections are nurtured face-to-face or in digital communities, the process of pursuing what excites us naturally draws others into our lives and reinforces a cycle of inspiration and support. Jordan challenges us to consider our earliest passions or those sparks from childhood that once brought us unbridled joy. Tapping into those interests after turning 50 and trying new experiences as well not only honor our past selves, but also create a pathway for an ever-evolving, purpose-driven future. The bottom line is, you don't find your purpose, you create it. You start by rewiring your internal narrative to overcome past limitations, subtract what doesn't serve you, and embrace those little P purposes which truly enrich your daily life. Every small, purposeful step builds a legacy, strengthens community bonds, and transforms not just your life, but the lives of those around you. People can connect with Jordan at www.jordangrumet.com. He is also active on Facebook, Instagram, and X. His podcast, Earn and Invest, can be found on several platforms, and Jordan's newest book, The Purpose Code, is recommended reading for finding happiness and leaving a lasting legacy. His first book, titled Taking Stock, is a guide to achieving independence, building wealth, and living a regret-free life. That's all I have for this week's show. If you'd like to start living a more meaningful life, I encourage you to download our free guide to finding purpose, which is available at www.forwardfrom50.com. I'll have another inspirational interview on the next episode of the Forward from 50 podcast. Thank you for listening, and if you like this show, please consider leaving a review wherever you download the episodes.